Well, I think you're right that back in the 1970s, when some of us geographers started to work more closely with Marxian theory, Marxist theories, there was a noticeable absence of concern, not only for spatial questions, but I think at that time it was also the case that environmental issues were also ignored. So that to the degree that even traditional geography works on spatial configurations and environmental, what was historically referred to as man-land relationships, to the degree that geographers worked on those aspects of what's going on in the world, there was clearly a problem for us to try to put the geography into Marxism.
Yeah.
This was done by talking more coherently about things like the production of space, the production of nature, so that some of the initial work that was done by myself, Neil Smith, and others was very much about trying to bring those things into Marxist thought. Marxist thought was very often rather reluctant to take all of that on board. I think it's taken pretty much a whole generation to get to the point where I think these questions of the environment and questions of spatial organization and so on are probably more widely accepted within Marxism now than certainly those many years ago. The problem, of course, is that Marxism is no longer so credible in general.
Yeah.
And after the end of the Soviet Union, and with the rise of identity politics, questions of race and gender and sexuality and all of those kinds of, so the definition of radicalism and the definition of what is critical shifted during the 1980s towards a much broader group of questions than those which were typically approached through Marxism. So while I think geographers did a fairly good job of bringing geography into Marxism, we didn't do such a good job of keeping the radical focus on the Marxist tradition. And to some degree, I think the Marxist tradition was too narrow on some of those other questions of sexuality and gender and race and ethnicity. And so I think that there has been a kind of a transformation in the nature of radical thought. So I think the situation today is very different than it was, say, in the 1970s. Well, I'm personally not interested in, say, professionalization of geographical knowledge. I think one of the virtues to me of a Marxist approach is that all disciplines disappear.
Yeah.
Which does not, however, mean that you can afford to do without spatial perspectives and environmental questions. So I'm not myself. I'm not terribly concerned with the definition of geography for professionalization purposes. My feeling in many parts of the world, however, is that this is a very key question. And certainly I encounter in Latin America generally, for example, a deep concern to define geography and to protect geography as a separate field of study, and therefore to define it in some way. To the degree that I would define it, I would say that there are three themes which geographers work with. One is space and spatial organization. The second is environment and environmental kind of questions. And third is the idea of place and region and territory and the like. And those themes, it seems to me, should belong in economics, and they should belong in political theory, and they should belong everywhere. Yeah. They should not be studied just simply in some discipline called geography when everybody else ignores them. So if you wanted me to give a definition of geography, it would be, it's a discipline that studies those three themes and then tries to project its understandings of those themes into the general question of how do we understand society, how do we understand politics, and you know, questions of how do we understand globalization, for example, those sorts of issues. So I would want to take it in that direction. To begin with, I think the whole sphere of education is terribly important. And I don't think that's confined to a school or university. That's what people learn in schools and universities is terribly important for what happens in society in general. So to be, for example, take a Marxist perspective inside of academia, it's not simply about academia. It's about trying to maintain within the field of knowledge production and knowledge reproduction an understanding of the world that is rather different from neoliberal theories and the like. And it is very often a struggle to maintain spaces inside of the university system where these things can be taught. And as a Marxist, I'm very much in a small minority. I have to be an activist inside of academia to preserve a space where things happen. So the first thing I would say is there is an image that says, well, professors are just dreamers and they sit there and they're doing this. Well, no, we're fighting all of the time. We're fighting the class struggle inside of the educational system, inside of the universities, and it's very hard. And of course, in the same way that if you're in a steel plant, when you're fighting, you have to fight within the confines of the plant and the rules of the plant, so you have to fight within the rules of academia when you fight. For example, I would not be where I am if I didn't publish a lot. I would not be where I am unless I publish things which are, quote, respectable, which to some degree means they're incomprehensible.
That's a great one.
So, because you're following the rules of academia, you see. I mean, I had many good colleagues who lost their jobs in academia because they wrote something and their colleagues said, This is just popular stuff. It's not academic. So I had to write things that were very academic.
Yeah.
In order to get my own. Now I'm okay. Right. I can write what I like, you know, so it's okay. But so, and all young academics face that problem. If you want to get a position, you have to write something that is respectable by the standards of the disciplines. This is why I hate the disciplines.
Yeah.
Because I always liked, you know, the title of Foucault's book, which is Discipline and Punish. Because it seems to me disciplines are about surveillance and punishment if you don't do the right thing. You see, so as an academic, you have to play the game. You have to play it in order to create the space where you can then teach Marx, where you can teach the things that I want to teach. So, so I want to go past the idea that somehow or other there's no activism inside of the university. In fact, there's a lot of class struggle goes on. Then the interesting question is what kind of relationship exists between the kind of struggles that are fought inside of the university and the struggles that are going on elsewhere in society. And in the same way that there's a kind of question of how does the teachers' union relate to the steelworkers' union, so there's a problem of how do academics relate to other social organizations. How do we relate to lawyers? How do we relate to, you know, social movements which are occurring in the city or internationally? How do we relate? My view of that is that we are just one component of a potential alliance. Again, there is sometimes an image that kind of says we are the intellectuals and we tell people what to do. I've never felt that was what how we should be thinking of ourselves, or how we should be thought of. We should be thought of as people who occupy a particular position in the division of labour, which has certain capacities and privileges and powers in the same way that lawyers can work with labour unions. So we can work with labour unions, or we can work with housing rights movements or something of that kind, and work with them both in support of what they're doing at the same time as we will want them to support what we are doing inside of the university. So I see it like this. Now, what kinds of things could I do that would help, say, a housing movement? I can't go into a neighborhood and say, this is how you should organize, this is what you should do, these are the issues. I can't do that, I should never do that. What I can do is to say, look, I have looked at the role of housing in relationship to capital accumulation in cities. I see certain things happening. Do you want to know about these things? Would that help you frame your struggle in a certain way? If you want to know, I'm happy to come and talk with you and be with you, and I can write things, and you know, on the right to the city or something of that, which might help frame a little bit what you're doing. So I can maybe do those things in the same way that a lawyer could come to a housing movement and say, all right, did you know the law allowed you to do this, and there are some possible legal things you could do. So I see our role very much as part of a broader struggle when we have a particular niche within the division of labour, and we can use things in that niche to help others in certain circumstances, but at the same time what we do is often informed by what we can learn when we work with, say, a housing movement. Some of my best ideas have come out from working with organizations on the ground. I see things that I don't see inside of academia, or I don't get from the literature. I see things happening, and so I learn from them, and that is also a very important part of the dialogue, is how much I can learn from them, as well as asking them, are there some things you want to know that I can help you understand?
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
I think that we have reached the point of saturation. I tend to call it an inflection point in the history of capital, where the expansionary possibilities are blocked. Not totally, there's still places like Africa that have not been fully colonized, Central Asia and so on, but when you look at how China was integrated, a huge economy, population of China was integrated into the global economy, how what was the Soviet Empire has been integrated, and you see that even that massive expansion has not actually delivered the growth that would give you kind of a satisfactory, kind of smooth path into the future of capital. I think you would say that there's a very severe danger of over-accumulation to the point of much surplus capacity in relationship to absorption of that capacity. So one of the things we've seen is the development of fictitious capital markets, like carbon trading, or, you know, asset bubbles and property markets. We're seeing a tremendous emphasis upon rentier kinds of investments, that is land. The land grab in Latin America and Africa is a big issue. You see it in terms of intellectual property rights, where people now kind of say, I don't care about production, I just live off the returns from a license to produce genetic materials and things of that sort. So we're moving into a kind of, I think, a rentier kind of economy, where the upper classes are no longer going to live off actually making things. They're going to live off controlling the resources of the world and living off the rents, which paradoxically is why Ricardo, back in 1817, thought that capital would have an end, because everything would be absorbed by the rentier class. And he said, when everything is absorbed by the rentier class, then capital no longer can exist. So Ricardo had a falling rate of profit theory and an end of capitalism scenario that depended on the power of the rentier. And he rested his argument on Malthus. Now, Marx didn't agree with Malthus. Keynes, at the end of the 1930s, talked about the euthanasia of the rentier, that the rentier would disappear. Okay? We're now in a situation where the rentier is back. And I think, with Ricardo, actually, and Marx, I think, would agree, you know, that is the end of capital, as we know it. And if that is the end of capital as we know it, then the big question is, what kind of economy is going to emerge from this long drawn-out period of crisis? Because the crisis that's been here in the United States since 2008 was in Brazil and Argentina in 2001 and 2002. It was in East Asia in 1998. It was in Russia. If you look, you see actually it was been one long crisis, kind of moving around geographically, and of course accompanied by this increasing financialization, which is something that's very important in Arrighi's analysis. So I think we're in for a major transformation. But the thing that is interesting is that in all preceding periods of danger for capital accumulation, new thinking has arisen. In this particular period, there's no new thinking. Just don't see it. People either go back to Keynes, or they kind of say, we need more monetarism. They only have two alternatives. There is absolutely no attempt by the bourgeoisie, as opposed to fringe people like myself in that area. There's no new thinking at all. And this is likely, I think, to make the crisis much worse. And in fact, what we see is a situation where there were ways to ameliorate and help the crisis, get out of the crisis. 3 years ago, they were not taken. It's a crazy situation. And you sort of say, and this comes back to what is going on inside of the universities. Neoliberal thought is dominant inside of the universities, and we're not going to be able to get anywhere unless there's a total revolution inside of the universities and inside the world of production of knowledge. Now, this is not to say that new knowledge drives the world, it does not. But new knowledge is a necessary condition for there to be kind of a movement of some kind towards some rational alternative, and it is not being produced except by fringe characters. It's not central at all inside of the university. Yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we've seen, accumulation by dispossession, I think, has been going on throughout the history of capitalism. But we've seen an increasing emphasis upon dispossession to the degree that the expansion of production itself has been limited, which is why I would associate dispossession with this rise of a rentier economy. And therefore, everybody wants to buy up land, buy up resources, and you will see exactly the same processes you're looking at going on in central India. You'll see it in Indonesia, you'll see it in Africa. This is a global process going on, which again, I don't think we've had enough studies on it, so I'm very glad to hear this is what you're writing about. I think people should be really writing about this and what kinds of transformations are occurring. In some cases, there are laws against foreign companies buying land. In Argentina, it works that way. So foreign companies then subcontract with local owners. So in a sense, it's a controlled thing, but so it's either direct or indirect control.
Different ways to access the land.
Yes.
Products again.
Yeah, what you're talking about has been going on for a long time. I remember coming across a memorandum from a consultancy company to companies located in California, and they basically said you should try and split your production process into small components. No one component should be more than 200 workers, and there should be, and the workplaces should be at least 200 miles apart. So, and they then said, if you do that, you'll have no problem with unions. Absolutely no problem. You'll be able to have total control over your labour force without any interference from unions. So, this is a geopolitical strategy on the part of corporations, and particularly with something like call centres, the cost of moving, I mean, it's hard to move a steel plant, but with call centres it's relatively easy.
Yeah.
What you've got to do is to take the computers and
Exactly.
and the same would be true of sweatshops. I remember in Los Angeles when I was there sometime in the 1990s, they had a lot of sweatshops producing garments, producing shirts and things. And every now and again there would be, they were illegal. So they simply kept moving them around, you know. And they never had more than 100 people, and then they just took the machines and moved them around. So there's always been a spatial strategy of labour control. And the only answer, of course, is to develop a labour movement that has the capacity to overcome these spatial problems. But that turns out to be very, very difficult. Workers are by and large more able to mobilize in a place than they can mobilize over space. So workers have a place-bound strategy of organizing, and one of the things that's come out of that is, and actually people in the labor movement understand this, that if you want to organize, you concentrate on employment that cannot move, or is very hard to move. For instance, hospitals. It's very hard to move a large hospital.
Yeah.
So you go after, you organize hospitals because they're hard. So if you can organize all those places that can't move, you could have a strong labor movement that can then turn its attention. So that if, for example, the hospital in Sao Paulo is organized and the hospital in the neighboring city is organized, if those hospital organizations and labor movements are looking at the situation and they see somebody move from here to there, they can then immediately use their power. So the labor movement itself as a whole has to have a, if you like, a geopolitical strategy. But historically, I've not seen much awareness within the labor movement of how to do that, or even thinking about it. And you know, so it will take some time, I think, for a labor movement to start to think in these terms. But this again is something that we geographers can point out and say, look, if you want, which is why I'm interested in questions like how do you organize a whole city? How do you organize a whole region? You know, so that you start to think of a slightly larger area of organization, and you start to think not simply about the organizer in a sector like hospital workers. You start to think about the working class in the whole region. And I really like this little idea by Gramsci, which I like to quote, which is, he said, well, in addition to the factory councils, you need ward organization, where you actually organize the whole of the working class rather than simply the working class in the factory. So you move from a sectoral form of organization to a geographical form, and you put the two together. And he was writing, well, that's what we should be doing back in 1919. You know, again, we've got a lot to learn about how to do that. I think every city in the world has a potentiality. The issues that arise in different cities obviously vary a great deal. So, and the potentiality for organizing varies a great deal, which is why I was very interested in, say, the case of El Alto.
El Alto,
And what happened in El Alto, what forms of organisation allowed certain things to happen. I'm interested also in looking more closely at what happened in Buenos Aires, and I think again what's been happening in Cairo. And then you look at, for instance, what's happening even in New York City with the Occupy movement that now has become the Occupy Sandy movement. and you know, are there, but again, these are very different, but at the same time there's a certain unity within the difference, and I would not want to say that the revolutionary potentiality is greater in these kinds of cities than in this kind of city. I think it varies a great deal, and there are all kinds of possibilities. And again, you know, whether something will happen or not, say in the United States, I really don't know. You really can't tell. Nobody, for example, anticipated what happened in Cairo, what happened in Tunisia. I mean, nobody anticipated that, and so who knows? I'm optimistic sometimes. I get waves of pessimism, you know. But I think at some point I can't see the point of being pessimistic. You know, I mean, if you're pessimistic, why do anything? You know. And you see a little bit of response to things, and you kind of go, well, you know, little things can have slightly bigger consequences, and for example, you know, putting my Marx lectures online, I found a very considerable positive response to that. And to the degree that people are not getting that kind of education, at least in this country, inside of universities, they now can get it outside. So I feel, well, all the time there are people who want to know these kinds of things and want to think about these kinds of things, then I should try to create the thinking that allows them access to a different way of thinking. So and yeah, it's small, you know. I mean, it's not as if I have access to the major media in this country. In fact, I'm systematically excluded from the major media in this country, which is not true in Britain, for example. When I go to Britain, I have to get on the BBC. So the BBC is all right, but here I can't get on anything. But at the same time, it's subversive. There's a subversive world out there, and if to the degree I can contribute, then I should. And even you come and interview me and ask my opinion, you see.
Yes.
So, well, there are at least some people who are interested.
Good.
And what about the utopias?
Well, the book where I considered that was In Spaces of Hope, and I wrote my own utopian sketch at the end of it. And there's a very interesting history about that, but my English editor said I shouldn't publish it. He was appalled that I would write such a thing. And by and large, it's never been discussed in the English-speaking world at all, the little utopian thing I did. But in Latin America, it was being quite widely read. You know, I met a lot of people who've read it, and got very interested in it and liked it and wanted to talk about it. So I can go to Latin America and I can have lots of conversations about this piece I did, my version of utopia future. And I don't know why that's the case, but it simply is. I mean, countries like Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, people have often read this.
That's interesting.
Things.
So maybe they have more to aspire or look forward to. I don't know. Have you found anything that would point to a reason?
I attribute it to the fact that I think people in Latin America have more imagination.
Right.
The English-speaking world is very empiricist. You know,
Yeah.
it's dominated by a certain kind of empiricism, which, particularly in the social sciences, you know. I also like the idea of a dialectical kind of utopianism, and that therefore it has to be dynamic and perpetually open. One of my favorite citations comes from a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who kind of said, you know, nature is about the perpetual pursuit of novelty, and I think human nature is about perpetual pursuit of novelty. And most utopian schemas historically have not been about the pursuit of novelty. They've been about suppressing the pursuit of novelty in favor of stationary state. And I'm kind of going, I think this is the wrong way to do it. So any utopian sketch has to be about pursuing new things in the world, making things different, and therefore perpetually transforming things. And I always remember I was at a theological conference where a lot of theologians were around, and I presented some of these ideas about dialectical utopianism to the theologians, and their response was very interesting. They said, you know, this is fascinating. They said, you know, the Christian concept of paradise is so boring. You understand that nobody wants to go there. So they all kind of started to discuss, and we actually, for about 2 years, we were having this correspondence about a dialectical conception of paradise. What would it look like?
That's fantastic.
And one of them said to me, you know, imagine a world where there's no new stories to be told.
Yeah.
Why would you want to live there? And so they were very excited by this whole kind of idea. And so I enjoyed that. Well, as you know, I'm not young, so the idea of going out there and doing anything radically new is not really very foremost in what I think. I really think about what is it that I already know, and to what degree can I utilize that knowledge to try to talk about the contemporary situation, and to create a framework for thinking about the contemporary situation, particularly through studying Marx.
Mm-hmm.
I just finished the written version of the companion to Volume 2 of Capital. And I think what was important for me about the Volume 1 companion was opening a path where people could understand what Marx was talking about. Volume 2 is doing the same thing, I think. I'm not the only person in the world who could do this, but I'm probably well equipped to do this, and I should do this. So right now it's about sort of thinking about what it is that I can do that might contribute to a better understanding of what's going on, what capital is about. I'm working on a text right now on the contradictions of capital, how to understand the notion of contradiction and how to understand the current situation in terms of those contradictions. So, and I try to do it in a way that's simple enough that many people can understand. It's not uniquely, I'm unfortunately not required to write incomprehensible texts.
Yeah.
So I can go off and simplify things and do this kind of thing. But there are some extra questions which arise out of Marx, which I am interested in, and one of them is the future of money. And there's a lot of work going on right now on alternative monies and how the monetary form relates to the nature of capital and capital accumulation. And I think there is something I might be able to say about that, partly coming out of Marx's critique of the alternative money theories of Proudhon, that I can take up some of the questions which are arising on the money front. So I may be working a bit on the money question.